Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Max Illingworth, and in this video we are going to be covering the Skilling Open tournament and day one of the knockout phase, also it's the quarterfinals of this event. Now here we have matches, 4 matches in fact, between 8 of the best chess players in the world, and I'll be showing you the key game from each of these matches right here in this video. So to start with, we have the game between Anish Giri playing as white against Magnus Carlsen playing as black, and this was the key 4th game of the match. The first 3 games ended in draws, so what happened in this 4th game to determine the outcome of the match? Winner takes all here. Well, let's find out. So the game went e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, castles, knight f6. So it's all very standard modern Italian with d3, d6, c3, h6 stopping any bishop to g5 moves. So yeah, the mouse slips are coming back to have some fun. So we had knight bd2, castles. Typically in these positions, white plan is to bring the knight to f1 like in a Spanish, and then to play for the d4 break. And we see that in this game as well, if a5, holding back any b4 moves. Knight f1, bishop b6, challenging the white bishop on c4. Black would be quite happy if the pawns were to be doubled here, as then he would get very good counterplay on the king side down the open h file. So we had bishop b5, Carlsen played knight e7, and then after d4 we get some quite sharp fury, where here Carlsen played a little bit of a surprise. Rather than playing the normal ed4 and making sure he doesn't lose that e5 pawn, instead he decided to be a little bit more inventive and played a move of bishop to a7, with the idea that if white plays the move d takes c5, of course knight g3 was another move, but after d5 black played knight to g4, and the idea you might think is that, well, you're forking the 2 pawns on f2 and e5, so you're getting back the pawn, right? But actually Carlsen had another idea where he looked beyond the veil, and after bishop e3 said, yeah, I could get back my pawn and be slightly worse, and have Giri trash talk me during the game saying, oh yeah, I'm just playing for 2 results, you're never going to beat me for this position in a million years. But instead Carlsen said, nah, I'm going to get the bishop pair, I'm going to channel my inner Svidler and inner Gustafsson and play it like a Marshall Gambit, sacrificing a pawn for the bishop pair and active piece play. So at knight g6 we see some more creativity here, where the idea is that in the game white took the knight, and we see that suddenly that rook has become very active. There's a lot of pressure now against that f2 pawn to e3 knight. I actually think it would have been better for Giri to trade the queens in this position and then try to consolidate with knight f3, stopping the rook coming in at d2. Certainly black has good compensation because the knight can come in at f4 and potentially d3 later. But okay, I think that white would be somewhat better if he had played it in this way. Instead, Giri went knight takes. We had this sort of dynamic position with rook takes, queen takes, rook a takes d8. You can see that the rooks are very active in this position. Then rook d1 is, well, I mean, if rook d1 is played, like you can even consider, for example, taking on a2 at some point in the game. Now this pawn is is on, as it were. So Giri played rook e2. We had the move where Carlsen decided to cash in his chips with bishop e3. The idea being that, what white would be the normal move for white would be, okay, let's just play rook e3, play rook d2, rook e2. I mean, black has full compensation here after rook f d8, because he has complete domination over that open d file. And already black is threatening to take on e2, and then jump the other rook into d2, rook on 7 franc money in the bank, and indeed we would cash in and take that pawn on b2 there. I'll have to say king f1, rook d1, you couldn't end up with a repetition of moves like rook e1, rook d2, and I mean, because the white pawns are under fire, there's really no great way for either side to avoid this repetition of moves. So that would be a normal outcome, then the match would have been tied, and we'd move on to day 2 to play it on even score. But Giri said, I'm a pawn up, and I'm playing Magnus Carlsen, and I'm going to go push for the win. And so he played the brave move f takes e3, which it shows I take great creative talent, to accept the double pawns. Unfortunately, it's just not that great a move, because after king f7, I mean, black's pieces are a lot more active. and the fact also white rook is tied up defending this pawn as well. These factors kind of outweigh the fact that white is currently up a pawn. Because I mean, it's very easy, to put a king on e5 and just go nom on e4, right? So we had bishop a4, probably not the best move. I think I would have gone b4 and tried to play a bit more actively. Because trading pawns is often a good idea when you're in a worse position. It sort of increases your drawing chances. Now after king e7, airing is in place. White king is cut off. The d file is in black's control, and white is going to be facing the meat grinder for a long time here. So we had h3, bishop c4 was played. I wonder if black can even do better, but this does look pretty good. Rook e1, rook d2 again allows to gangbusters on the d file and on the f file. The blind pigs on the 7 that's devouring everything in sight. After rook c2, black then jumped in, penetrated the position the way you're meant to with the rooks on the open file with rook d3, hitting that weakling on e3. White tried to defend it with rook e1, but then king d6 followed. And the plan is simply king d6, e5, king e4, rook e3, and just laugh in white's face. So we had bishop to b3. Black side to keep the bishop, because black's bishop is more active than white's bishop at the moment. We had rook c to c1. Ray white is contorting and twisting just to try to avoid the massacre. King e5 followed. Rook c d1. I mean, keep in mind this is just a rapid game, but Carlsen's playing it like it's a classical game in strength. Rook fd8, where he's saying, I'm not going to take you and let you just take over the file. I'm going to make you take me, and then I will take the file for myself, punk. Now, in this position, white played the move rook d3. Engine says rook f1 is a better defense, but I mean, white is struggling either way. So now the bishop comes in. Maybe you're expecting the rook to come in, but then Giri's trick would have been that he could play the move rook f1 and say, alright, I'm going to sacrifice a few soldiers to get my rook on the 7th rank and start getting some money in my bank for a change. But instead, yeah, bishop d3. And you might be a bit nervous as black about a move like rook d1, but actually then in that case you can play rook d6 and you will start taking pawns, and pin is nothing whatsoever to fear in this case. So we had the move king f2, rook d6 was played. Very nice move to prepare to cut the king off once more. Bishop d1. And now suddenly all of the weaknesses are too much for white. After bishop c4, we're not just hitting that weak pawn on a2, but as we see after b3, there's also rook d2. The rook on the 7th rank comes back with a vengeance. And after king g3 and bishop e6, it's only bad choices for white, because rook e2 trying to defend the pawn would lose the bishop, of course. If you try to push the pawn with a4, then b3 is a weakness. I mean, just look at how tied up white's pieces are. It's like Giri got sent to a naughty corner, is now in the straitjacket. You can even play moves like b6, g5, c5, just slowly improve the position. At some point, c4 is just going to weaken all of these pawns, and you're just going to cash in and take all their pawns. Like a game of nom-nom. So after rook to f1, black played rook takes a2. Unfortunately, rook f8 and rook d2 is kind of a bit embarrassing for white. Everything just collapses from there. So Giri went into swindle mode, played bishop g4, but the rest was pretty easy for Carlsen from here. A pawn is just too much of a monster away from all the other pieces. That's why we call it an outside pass pawn. It's like that outside runner in a football game that no one sees coming. So after rook f8, king e4, rook c8, trying to trade some pawns, but the problem is it's all Carlsen. After bishop d5, that pawn on g2 is coming under fire. Only way to save it now is to play the move bishop f3. But now we have a refutation of the saying of all rook endgames are drawn, but not when Magnus Carlsen's playing. Rook b2, defending the pawn. Rook g7. Rook to b6, a safe move to make sure all the pawns are guarded. The white has absolutely zero counterplay. I mean, if white wants to have any chance of saving his position, he urgently needs to get his rook behind the opponent's passed pawn. The problem is that you're not going to get that, because black gets his rook behind the passed pawn first with rook a6, rook b7, rook king c5, and it's no bueno for white here. After rook c7, king b6, rook c1, a3, just keep running, just keep pushing a pawn. We're getting a touchdown, bro. Rook a1, so the rook is cut off, and now we cut the king off with rook to a4. What a powerful move, cutting the king off, hitting the weakness, and it's all toast for white. Game ended f4, h5, king f3, king c5, king e3, king d5, and all roads lead to Rome at this point. King f3, king e6, And because we're going king f5 and just collecting the harvest, because, it's farming season, we got the tools and the hoe out, white just resigned here. So yeah, a pretty crushing win by Carlsen. I mean, we know him to be an endgame genius, and he proved it again in this game. And with that, well, Geary was down, but not out, because there is day 2, where Geary will be in a must-win situation, and will need to win the match to keep his life alive in the Skilling Open. And if he loses, well, I guess he'll just have to keep skilling for next time. Well, moving on to the next game, just going to save these notes for, my million students I will have one day. Next game, or the next match more precisely, was one played between Jan Nepomniachtchi, one of Russia's very top players. I think he actually is currently Russia's top player on the classical ratings, against Levon Aronian, Armenia's top player. He recently came equal first in Norway chess. And at this point, the match was tied 1.5, 1.5. The players had traded blows at this point. They both had exactly the same rating of 2-7, 7-8. So let's see who could break the symmetry in the score. So the game, funnily enough, was yet another modern Italian. I mean, it's like, saying, I'm going to give you an extra paycheck, an extra commission if you decide to play the modern Italian, because it's an opening where you don't have that boring Berlin that, is like a dagger to your heart, saying, no, not the boredom. Ugh. But okay, now we have some fun. We have castles, d6. See, Aronian has no fear. Like, he's not afraid of this bishop g5 nonsense. And Nepomniachtchi decided not to play it either. He went h3. And Aronian said, you know what, I'm not just going to play like Carlsen with h6, a5, and bishop e6. I'm going my own way and playing rook to e8, showing some great creativity. And after the move knight bd2 and bishop to e6, well, Nepo said, okay, if you're not going to play a5, I'm going to go for a little queenside expansion, get a little nibble here on the queenside with b4, bishop b6. Now a4, he just keeps coming, saying, I'm going to do a Noah's Ark trap on your bishop. Aronian says, nah, and plays the move a6, making a little luft for the bishop on a7. If you thought luft was just to avoid back rank mate, well, you see another example here. Nepomniachtchi played bishop takes e6. Black took back with the rook in order to keep his structure as solid as possible. And now after white's move queen c2, well, there is one pawn break that black is always dreaming of playing in these positions. Do you see what that pawn break is, folks? You can always pause the video, have a think about it, and see if you played like Levon Aronian here as black. Okay, congratulations, friends. The answer is that the move d5 was played. We get those pawns side by side in the center. You were taught it when you were 6 years old in chess class, but it's still relevant for grandmasters today. Game continued bishop b2. The theoreticians might look at rook d1 as a better try for an edge, because now black side going for the king side attack. Knight h5, thinking about knight f4, swing the rook over, and bam, we've got some mating threats on g2, bro. And probably white should have been a little prophylactic and played king h2 to, get out of the way and avoid the massacre that now followed. Because, I mean, now with knight f4, you can at least play g3 and, you can kick that knight away without losing the pawn on h3. That's the whole genius of white's play. Instead, we go b5. That's what Nepomniachtchi played. Black went knight e7, so knight's moving us out a little bit closer to the king side. You're already thinking of checkmate. I mean, you don't have to play the knight off to, go for mate against the opponent's king, though I will admit it would help a little bit. So after c4, we're trying to build up some pressure against that e5 pawn. And, well, you could have had some fun playing a move like knight f4 and just, lighting the board on fire, like Mikhail Tal, saying, you can take the pawn, but I'm just going to keep on attacking you with knight eg6. Or, if c5, bishop a5, the position is just so crazy, like, it'd be cheating to tell you what the engine says here. Well, I'll tell you anyway, it's 0, 0, 0 at depth 99, and I have no idea why exactly. So let's see what happened in the actual game. It was d takes e4, which was actually a mistake, because now you had a monster knight on e4, just seeing everything, like he's a monster with 1,000 eyes who sees it all. So, in this position, Aronian played c6, and I mean, here's where Nepomniachtchi could have won the game, just got complete strategic domination. He could have played the move c5, with the idea that if you try to keep that e5 pawn alive with bishop to c7, white goes b6 in. I mean, just look at these guys, these are prisoners in their own camp, The rook is saying, get out of my way, you stupid bishop on b8. Bishop's like, oh, I'm comfortable here, I can pray for the rest of my life, bro. But anyway, the move Nepomniachtchi played was still not bad. Knight takes e5. But the problem is that it lost a lot of the advantage. Because after knight g6, suddenly, Aronian's getting that Marshall style compensation. I mean, Aronian loves playing the Marshall, and so he was very happy to get it even against the Italian game. White played the move d4. Obviously, if you were to take the knight, then the rook slides in and, is facing against that enemy king. So Nepomniachtchi wants to avoid that. And it's a technique you'll often see like strong players play. They'll try to keep the tension between the pieces. Of course, if you go bishop to d4 here, then moves like rook 81 and the pin are going to kind of hurt you a little bit, because you're going to miss not having that bishop pointing towards the enemy king. But the game saw knight hf4. And now a solid move for white would be just to play something like king h1 and, just get out of the pin and get out of this g-file. Being very prophylactic as such, You might have heard like the Grandmasters or they follow prophylaxis say, like ninjas, they anticipate the opponent's moves before they can even play them, kind of like Petrosian. But unfortunately, Nepomniachtchi had left his ninja skills at the door in this game. Or maybe he tried too hard to be a ninja, because he played knight to f3, which is not a terrible move, but now Aronian comes in with knight 4 and says, you move backward, I move forward. You move backward, I move forward, and before you know it, it's checkmate. So we had knight h4, queen h4, knight g3, rook a8, and after the game, Aronian shared, well, if my position was bad, I'd have nothing to be nervous about, but now that I'm actually getting some real compensation, I'm actually kind of nervous, so I might blow this great position. A little bit of fun humor there. Well, in the game, we had b takes c6, b takes c6, captures, bishop to c3, and then h5, this is what the Grandmasters do. If you don't see a way to get through the pieces, you use the pawns. Just imagine if you get in queen g5 and you get in h4, then suddenly you might be looking at a nice checkmate on g2. So remember that Grandmaster technique. They've got a knight on g3, h5, h4, boot it away and show that steed who's boss. So in this position, white played a move rook a to b1, which is where things start to go a bit downhill. I mean, you're better to have the rook in the center, get that d-pawn moving and bring your bishop to life, give it some fire. Well, after bishop to c7, Nepomniachtchi thought he could keep on kicking this bishop around like a soccer ball. Maybe he thought he was like, Maradona on the field. You had rook to b7. And here is where you have the chance to find Aronian's winning move. Do you see the move that he played to punish white's excessive greed in hitting that bishop all over the place? Well, you can always pause the video if you need more time to think about it. For the rest of you though, let's see the action and see how that bishop on c7, the sniper from afar, had the last laugh. The answer is we had knight takes h3, boom, a check, a capture. That's for forcing moves to look at first in order to see whether they win or not, but this one does win. gh3, boom, bishop takes g3, and the point is that if white were to chop the bishop with fg3, we go queen g3, and white is the one losing the house. Either the rook penetrates with decisive effect, or if queen g2, we will simply take that bishop pawn at g3, thank you very much. And if white tries to get the blind pigs on the 7th, well, then black hits first. Queen takes d4. And I mean, white might have 3 attackers hitting this pawn, but we go check, check. And after king h2 and queen to d6, white is going to have to go back. After queen g3, you've got a rook e2 move to decide the game. And if king h1, see, my mouse is so excited by when it's not letting me move the pieces properly. Like, it's getting all jittery and stuff. So now we have rook to e1, that's the key move. Then we force the rook back. We neutralize their initiative. We can play queen f6 if we want to show off like Michael Jordan. And then we just win easily from there. In the game, we had to move d5, but then black ignored the threat to rook. I mean, if when you have a mate threat, it gives you the liberty. So queen takes h3, threatening mate on h2. And after fg3 and rook e2, it's going to be checkmate soon with queen h2 or, queen g2 business. And so Nepomniachtchi resigned, and Aronian closed out the match 2.5, 1.5 with this key clutch win. And it goes to show, just because you're in a bad position, it doesn't mean you're going to lose. Keep fighting, keep punching, look for those tactics and tricks, and maybe you could win almost a miniature like Aronian did here. Let's move on to the next game after I first save this one here. Excuse me, getting so excited, it's giving me a little indigestion, So, okay, the next game we have here, this one is from game 3 of the match between Wesley So and Timur Rajabov. Why not game 4, you might be asking? Well, the answer is that going into this match, Wesley So was behind. He was down 1/2 to 1.5, and Rajabov knew that if he won this game, he would close out the match and it would be all over. So let's see what happened in this exciting English opening, which was all fire. So c4, knight f6, knight c3, e5. We had knight to f3, knight c6, and now e3. So maybe Wesley So had studied the Silicky Canson lifetime repertoire, but it was Radjabov who got an extra life in this game. So bishop b4, queen c2, black castled. He decided not to take and, let white get the bishop pair advantage. But now the knight jumps in with knight d5 and saying, hey, my knight's in the center. It might not technically be an outpost, but good luck trying to kick me away with c6 when your knight is in the way. Black played rook e8, trying to keep the tension the way grandmasters do. And now, rather than trying to be all, fancy with the knights, like doing a little knight stance, a little pirouette, instead, So played the move queen at f5, with the idea that after d6, knight takes f6. Well, Magnus Carlsen had lost his 125-game non-losing streak against Duda when he played g takes f6 in this position. So Radjabov said, okay, I'll take with the queen instead, and then accept these double pawns around the king. But okay, if you've been playing the Sveshnikov half your life like me, then you'll say, the double pawns are a strength, not a weakness. I'm going to push them down the board and we'll see who's laughing at the end of this game. So played the move a3, bishop tucked back, b4, kind of like the Nepomniachtchi Aronian game, saying to kick that bishop around. Bishop b2 is played. At this stage I kind of like white's chances, because the bishop looks silly, you've got the double pawns, and what does black have in return, you might be wondering. Well, this is where Radjabov came up with some fresh ideas of his own, playing the move of a6. He decided not to show his hand with e4 and f5 as the Indian would like, but say, I'm just going to make some look for the bishop and play a little waiting move. You'd be surprised how many times a little waiting move caused the opponent completely, have a brain embolism to explode and self-destruct. And it looks like that maybe is what happened in this game here, where So got a little bit too fancy. Here I would just keep it simple. I go bishop e2, I would castle, maybe think about pushing for a d4 break in the middle game, supported by rook on d1. And I'd ask black, well, what's your compensation for having the double pawns and a bad bishop? We all know that a bad bishop's, they try to keep the story undercover, but in reality, you can't hide the fact that bishop is biting on granite at the moment. So we had castles long, which I think was a bit too ambitious. E4 already could sort of ask some questions about that weak square on d3. Instead, Radjabov played bishop f5. I think the plays were a little bit tight at this point because there were some mistakes, but we're going to forgive them for the action that they created. So rook g1, the knight came to e7. And okay, white played d4, and you might think, okay, it's all Wesley So now. He's got the beautiful center. All of black's minor pieces look silly. But Radjabov is known to be one of the trickiest tacticians in the world. He managed to beat Garry Kasparov when he was just 15 years old. How many other people can claim that? Of course, it's when Radjabov was 15 years old, not when Kasparov was 15 years old. The details matter here. So after d4, we had to move bishop to e4, trying to put some pressure on the knight. I'm not sure if it really does that much. The knight kicked it away. Bishop g6. And here is where So was a bit too cautious, because So is like one of these very peaceful players where he'll say, okay, I'm happy to sort of take a draw in a better position to, secure the tournament win or to have a really good result. It's not like someone like, let's say, Mamadrov, who, if you're going to need to draw to win the tournament, Shak Mamadrov would still go at you and hack your king to bits, It's just a different style. So here's where we use something I call the Illingworth principle. And what is the Illingworth principle? The Illingworth principle is that the best way to exploit the weakness of the double pawns is actually to undouble them. Now, you might think, what, if you're are you on drugs, bro? But actually, after d takes c5, f takes c5, and g4, we see that by clearing this pawn, we now can go, and try to trap that bishop in on g6. Eventually, we can swing these pawns around, just pawn storm the king. Who says you need a queen to checkmate the king? White's got very good chances here. Still black's bishops are bad. The knight is completely dominated by the white pawns, and I think that white is already technically winning here. You can play it out against your computer if you really want to prove it. So after bishop g6, instead, So decided to be peaceful and play knight to f3. And Radjabov sensed that sign of weakness and said, oh, you want to draw? You don't want to come at me? Then I'm going to go at you first. So he played a5, starting to chip away at that white king, saying, your king is weaker than my king now. b5, trying to keep the a file closed, but c6, forcing a new file open. You just can't keep this guy down. In fact, white probably should have played this move of b takes c6. Because in that way, if you take with the knight, you get this weak pawn on d6. But if you take with a pawn, here's where we start to play with some tactics, where we can go for the move c5, ripping apart black structure even more. so that if they take on c5, we move past, we take on e5. I mean, just look at this. Like, look at these doubled pawns. Look at the, the bishop trapped behind. I mean, I call this c5 pawn a traitor pawn here because it's blocking his comrade, the bishop on b6, from having a good lease of life. I mean, you know that feeling like when you're sort of, working for someone, like you're blamed by saying, oh, I'd be worth so much more, like if the boss just let me do like whatever I want and didn't make me do all these little tasks, like those kind of excuses. Maybe that's what the bishop on b6 would be saying at this moment about a pawn on c5, that, it's the lesser guy is getting in his way. Well, in the game, we had the move a4. Black played c takes b5, a takes b5, and yeah, we got a passed pawn. So let's go running. Passed pawns must be pushed, is what they like to say. Bishop a3, e takes d4. And here what I would have done as white, if I was in Wesley So's shoes, I would have played the move knight takes d4, and then I would have had the pressure against the pawn with the bishop from the rook. I mean, just look at the knight as outpost. It's absolutely beautiful, and still we can, we still have not forgotten completely about the idea of playing for checkmate in the endgame, because, that's what the pros do. And of course, someone who's going to say, like, oh, but Max, you wouldn't have got to this position, and, I'd be like, yeah, I don't play chess anymore, I record for you guys. So after ed4, we had e takes d4, and here is where Rajabov brought out the tricks. You think tricks are just for kids? Just wait until you see this position. Wait, can you find the move that Rajabov played in this position to be all tricky and sneaky and all that? Yeah, well done if you found the move of knight d5, putting a knight on pre and saying, the normal rules of chess, the normal laws, they don't apply to me. I'm going to just rebel and do whatever I feel like. Because if you go cd5, something that rook swings in. Remember, rook on the 7th rank, money in the bank? Well, we go rook to c2, boom. And if white plays king a1, then here is the key move that Rajabov had to see. Can you find this move yourself? What black should play in this position? Okay, pause the video if you need time to think about it. I'm gonna have a drink of water while you do that, because it's a real hot day here in Vietnam. Okay, the answer is that we need to bring more piece in the attack. We need to throw more wood on that fire, and the move bishop a5 is the way to do it. Going for bishop to c3 and lining up the king for the big discovered checks. But if you try to interfere with bishop d3, then we go for knife and fork, rook c3, hitting the bishop, hitting the other bishop. And if they were to try to take and, run with the bounty, we take. And then we do the intermediate check of rook to b3. And when the king moves, well, then we can go rook e2, collect the harvest. And I mean, white is just complete toast here. So that was a long explanation of why white can't take the knight. But, we cover everyone here. Doesn't matter whether you're a beginner, a grandmaster, or somewhere between, we got you covered. So after king to b2, we go bishop to a5, saying, you know what? I'm still not going to leave the knight, not be taken. Because, I mean, here white really should take that knight, actually. But instead after rook a7, you might be wondering, how do you get out of this rook c2 move? And there's only one move, actually. White would have had to have found the incredible rook d3, putting the rook in harm's way in order to stay in the game. And now black has to find another incredible move. Like, this is like a real test for the grandmasters watching. To find rook c4, with the idea of simply playing deadly quiet move rook c8, rook c2, and saying, your position is so dominated with such terrible useless piece on the king's side, I can even just play a deadly quiet move, play two moves without no real threat to your piece, and I can still get the threats against your king that you can't stop. I mean, if that's not badass confidence, I don't know what is. So instead of that, Wesley So got psyched out, we got punked, and he played bishop d6. But okay, still the position is okay for white. But now knight c3, and there's forks galore here. After rook c4, we had knight e4, going for a fork here, fork there. I mean, look at that king being all open as well. Now in this position, white could have played bishop f4 and offered their pawn as, a bribe, saying, take the pawn and leave my kingdom be. Go chase somebody else. But instead we had bishop to g3. And here is where Rajabov continued the attack. It's like a pit bull terrier, just not letting go of the guy. We had a3, because I mean, if you take that pawn, the little discovered check is going to rub some salt in the wounds. After king a2, you could just keep that passed pawn alive with bishop to b4, and say, okay, I'm going to go knight c3, and I don't care if your king's in the way. I'm going to queen the pawn, put the queen on top of your king if I have to. But instead, we had knight to c3, saying, I'm going to make you take my pawn. And here's where we have the real brilliance, you know. We have the move bishop b4, like tactical wizardry. I mean, you can't leave that bishop b, because I mean, when they slight you like this, like you're not just going to annoy it, leave alone and let them escape with that. But after king b4, we have knight a2, forking the king and rook. And now if Sir had any sense of self-preservation, he would have played the move king b3, knight c1, and then brought the king back and, you know, said, okay, cool, we'll call it a draw. You know, maybe my arms were taken off in game 1 or game 2, but, you know, we'll call it a draw and fight another day. But instead, we had the move king to c5. You know, the king's going for a run, it's like, hey, I'm playing football, let's score a touchdown. But unfortunately, that's not quite how chess works. You know, it's the pawns that are meant to score the touchdowns, not the kings. And here, after the deadly quiet move, you know, this is all about the deadly quiet moves here. We have rook to e6. And the threat is simple. I'm going to go b6, king d5, and then bishop e4. Checkmate Grandmaster. And So couldn't find a good way to deal with it, because I mean, his rook is also hanging as well, you know, if it wasn't bad enough. So played the move b6, but then we had rook a5, checkmate. I mean, look at this. Like, this looks like a sort of thing you'd have in a Morphy game or a Greco game or an Anderson game, you know, not in a game between top GMs. So, you know, you can see that Radrobov really brought the heat in this match. He just swiped out So 2.5, and now it's up to Wesley. So, like, he needs to win the next match tomorrow in order to have a chance and stay in the Skilling Open and make it to the big playoff match for the third one. Like, he's fighting for his life now. So, having looked at this really beautiful attacking King Hunt of a game, now we get to the final game that I want to show you. And finally, this one's not one of the later games, but this is actually the first game. I mean, if you ever had that feeling of momentum where, you know, you have that first game, you win, and you're just on a roll, and you just go, yeah, I'm so strong. I win the second game, I win the third game, I win the fourth game, I win the fifth game. No one can stop me now. Though that's the kind of momentum that Michel Grave was feeling, you know, when he won that first round game. Oops, I spoiled the result a little bit, but okay. In this game, we had Michel Grave as white, playing against Nakamura as black in round Skilling Open. And these are two of the very best blitz and rapid players in the world, so you knew this was going to be an absolute dogfight. So here's how the game went. It was e4, e5. Nakamura played his trusty Berlin Wall. You know, he decided, you know, MVL said, you know what, I'm the only top player in the world who decides to enter the Berlin endgame regularly as white. And I know some of you are going like, oh, Berlin endgame, what is this? You know, please, like, kill me already so I don't have to deal with this. But wait, we're going to see some real sacrifices, some real hack attacks, even with the queens off the board. Just make sure that you don't miss this one. So after queen d8, king d8, h3. You know, MVL is so confident. Like, everyone else says the ending is a dead draw. MVL says, I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm better than you and I'm going to show it. And sure he did in this game. After king e8, you know, the king stays in the center rather than trying to evacuate to the queen side. Knight c3, h5, going for the light square blockade with the bishop. Bishop f4, bishop e7, both sides just developing their pieces, getting ready for the real battle to follow. Bishop e6, knight g5. And, you know, they play these moves with machine gun rapidity, because, you know, they propel their engine fine, so it's like ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. So after rook fe1, bishop to b4, a3. You might think, what? But the idea of bishop b4 was to take the knight and double the pawns, and you'll provoke him to do it anyway. But you see these engines, they go a little bit deeper, because they realize that, well, you wouldn't exactly want black to go grabbing that pawn on a2 for free and, you know, riding that a pawn to a queen and to the bank all the way to the end of the game, right? So we had h4, trying to make all of these pawns inflexible. MBL says, you can't stop me, I'll play g4 anyway. We had hg3, fg3, knight e7. You know, and the idea of knight e7 is try to hit this pawn, try and bring your knight around to attack some of the white pieces and pawns. We had h4. And actually this was funny, like this, I'll share a little story with you just before this game was played. So back in the 2020 candidates, which was cancelled, which was postponed rather for seven rounds due to the COVID-19 situation. Well, what happened was Grishuk was thinking in his position for a whole hour as black, you know, going into the tank, thinking. And then what happened was he spent an hour on playing knight e7, and he spent all his time thinking about the move g4, and then MVL blitzed out h4, and then Grishuk had to think for another 21 minutes saying, well, okay, I guess I wasted half an hour. But he said, okay, if I hadn't wasted it, I would have found another way to waste it. So it's a little bit of chess humor. It shows that even the world's top chess players have a few idiosyncrasies that are part of their brilliance. So The game continued with knight to d5, bishop to c1, offering some bait to black, which black decided to take with both hands, knight c3, rook d3. And actually Nakamura had this position before in a game against Wei Yi, so we're sort of following games that both the players had played against different opponents. So rook f4, knight b6, rook ef1, so white is now piling up that pressure against that f7 pawn. You can see that black's king is sweating bullets in the center. And previously, Nakamura had played the move bishop c4 against Wei Yi, but then he decided to follow Grishuk and play rook to g6. And after the move rook to f5, so we're still following this MVL Grishuk game. They call it MVL because like Maxim Vastrela graph takes a long time to say. And if you're like in the war zones, like if someone's like about to throw a grenade at MVL, like you're not going to say like Maxim Vastrela graph or it already have blown up by the time. You say MVL and then he gets in time. So you see, like having a nickname, a shortened name can save your life. Now the game continued rook to e1. Black played the move bishop to e6. And unfortunately, bishop e6 is where it started to go downhill for Nakamura. He had to bring a final piece into play. One thing that a lot of the world's best chess coaches say, and including me, they say, you've got to bring the worst placed piece into play. This is a team sport. We've got to make sure everyone's lifting their weight. Everyone's on the field, getting in the action. And that's why rook d8 was the key move. Taking that d-file, getting the rook in the fight, and that is what would have allowed black to stay in the game. Though knowing MVL, he had analysed this all the way to move 70, where black finally scrapes a draw in a rook versus bishop endgame. Anyway, the game saw bishop e6. Nakamura was not quite as well prepared as MVL. But the thing is, MVL also missed a shot. Can you find the move that MVL missed here, so in order to get a massive advantage as white? You can pause the video if you need a bit more time to think about it and ponder it. Well, the answer is that white could have played the move knight takes e6, removing the best black piece black has in the Berlin. Because that light squared bishop, it just blockades all of the white pawns in one go. It's a super bishop. It's better than a rook, man. But if black plays rook ef6, rook e6, we go rook ef1, we hit this pawn. And if they try to defend with rook e7, we hit them hard with bishop g5. And if rook d7 is played, then boom, we go e6, hitting the rook, hitting the pawn. And unfortunately, they can't take it, because then rook f8 is checkmate. So that would have been very powerful, and if you play rook e6, then the rook is just on a deserted island. If we get the king to h3 and go h5, we're even trapping that rook. So that would also be pretty depressing for black. Still rook f1 and invading with the rook is going to bring the harvest. That's sort of a theme of these games we've looked at today. Is like the rook invading the 7 franc. Like that's how you win a chess game. You get the rook in their face and make sure they can't get it out. Now the game saw instead the move rook f2. So if you found 96, congratulations, you played better than MVL in that game, in that position. But here, Nakamura missed a chance to go king e7 and, try to get his knight back into play. Instead, he played the move rook d8. And, well, now we had h5. And here is where, again, Nakamura had to sort of cut his losses. He had to sack the exchange with rook takes g5, and then bring the rook to d5. And you might think, okay, white is up the exchange for a pawn, so he's just better. But it's not that simple, because, where is white's pawn break? If he goes h6, we simply capture, and it's not clear how white's breaking through. And this bishop is just seeing everything. It's a monster, like, with 1,000 eyes here. The rook can come in, and you can start, hitting these pawns with the rook and with the knight. Black is in no way worse in this position at all, because these rooks don't have any open files to, breathe fire down. But after rook h6, this is where, MVL struck. He hit with a beautiful tactic of, he didn't try to defend the pawn h5. That would lose the initiative. Instead, he played the move knight takes f7. It's a capture. If there is a winning move in the position, then in a lot of cases it is going to be a check, or it's going to be a capture, or a move that threatens something. So MVL was completely right to start by looking at these kind of moves. Black played the move bishop f7, because obviously rook h5, you win the exchange, and life is good as white. The general principle is when you're up, having one more rook than the opponent, trade off their rook so that you're the only one with the rook's magic powers. Well, we had the move bishop f7, but then bishop h6, g8-6. And black might have 2 minor pieces for the rook, which materially is very good, but it's all MVL from here. e6, kicking that bishop. You're not going to put your bishop in self-imposed isolation with bishop g8, because the bishop hasn't caught COVID yet. but now we have bishop h5, and now another tactical blow, g4. Like, this is vintage MVL, full of tricks, very sharp calculation, like razor sharp calculation. And the problem for black is that if he tries to save that bishop with bishop g6, then boom, rook f6, not giving any time for the bishop to catch its breath. And if bishop f7, h7, then we go e7, we hit the rook, we threaten rook f8, and it's all toast for black. In the game we had bishop takes g4, and now that the bishop has finally vacated this key diagonal, it means we can play e7, knowing that if the rook were to try to move away, that you can simply go rook f8 and even rook d8, checkmate, and life is good. Because I mean, otherwise, like, if the bishop was on h5, you'd have like rook c8, rook f8, and king d7, and your bishop would be able to stop the pawn queening. But not here. So the game concluded knight d7. White was up, well, 2 rooks. He's up 2 exchanges for 3 pawns. So how often do you get a crazy material imbalance like this? But as hard as Nakamura fought, it wasn't enough against a gun like MVL. We had rook f7, h5, rook to g7, hitting that bishop and stopping the pawn's advance. Personally, I would have put the rook behind the passed pawn for what it's worth. Knight c5, rook e5, keeping those rooks nice and active. b6, king f2, a5, and here MVL decided to be Mr. Practical and just play rook c5, saying, well, give up 1 exchange so you're left with this dumb bishop. When you've got the Irish pawns, it's almost like they've got a potato famine here in black's camp. So we had king c8, rook c5, collecting that harvest. We go nom again, rook a5, king b6, rook g5, and MVL said, I'm not taking any prisoners here. So bishop d1, c3, c5, king e1, hitting that bishop, bishop f3, king to d2. So we're bringing that king to the king side, to queen side, to shepherd home the a3 pawn, king b5, rook g7. Whichever pawn I didn't have undefended, we hit him where it hurts. So now the game continued, c6, king c1. I mean, the end is so near, like even my mouse is glitching trying to avoid the massacre. So c4, rook g5, c5, king d2. So now we're running back this way. We've got our target, and now we're going to focus fire. h4, king e3, bishop d1. And after rook g1, Nakamura resigned here, because that pawn is a goner after rook h1 and rook h4. Then we're just going to hit these pawns, and it's just all game over. So yeah, that's basically how MVL won against Nakamura. The next 3 games in this match ended in draws, meaning that Vashelgrad won this part of the match. Actually, it's funny, Nakamura had fought, actually like I had initially, that this was just like 1 match, and then if you lost this match, you're out of the whole tournament. But actually, Nakamura has another chance. He has a chance to come back tomorrow and see if he can even the scores and get it to a playoff to decide who advances to the semis. So, with that being said, well, it was a pleasure to take you through day 1 of the Skilling Open Knockouts Quarterfinals phase. There's Grandmaster Max Illingworth here. And do make sure to like this video, subscribe to keep up to date with more of these epic videos and Grandmaster game analyses that will make you a better chess player, and enjoy the whole process along the way. And also make sure to check the description below for a special opportunity of how you can improve your chess even faster with my world-class Grandmaster training. So I will see you on the inside, chess champions.